If we went to another planet, if we went up to Mars or wherever and found just one of the let's say houseplants, I'm looking at some plants around the office. If you just found one of those on another planet, governments would invest billions in, maybe trillions in investigating that life form and what it would mean to us. And we've got all of that across our planet in bucket loads. So why don't we invest in protecting what we've got on this beautiful planet?
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. This episode takes us to the Cornish coast, hence the change of intro sounds and the inclusion of some whales from a hungry grey seal pup. Grey seals are globally rare, and the UK is lucky to have a third of the global population. They are particularly near and dear to my heart after I did a project with the fantastic Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust a few years ago, and our efforts got some great public support from a Cornwall-based brand called Finisterre. Make sure to check out the organization through the link in our show notes. Our human guest for this episode is the great Hugo Tagholm. Hugo is a massively influential voice and leader in ocean activism in the UK and was my way in to understanding the issues facing the oceans and waterways of my new home in England after moving here a few years ago. He led Surfers Against Sewage into becoming a full-fledged charity and one of the most respected and trusted voices when it comes to water issues in the UK. After an incredible run at SAS, Hugo became the executive director for the UK at Oceana. In this episode, we talk about the ocean as a great leveler, working with nature rather than against it, how we can spur a just transition to transform our economy and culture for a more environmentally friendly future, and even a little bit about what Hugo talked about with His Majesty the King, King Charles, when he was the Prince of Wales and became a patron of Surfers Against Sewage. At the time of this recording, the King's cancer diagnosis was not known, and so myself, and I'm sure Hugo, wish him a full and lasting recovery. King Charles has been and continues to be a powerful voice in the UK and globally on environmental issues. Many thanks to Hugo for taking time to chat. Make sure to check out the show notes for a link to Oceana's latest campaign video in support of banning bottom trawling in our marine protected areas. We'll also include links to where to follow Hugo on social media to stay up to speed on the latest when it comes to protecting our oceans. And as always, if you like this episode, please share it. I don't assume that any listen is guaranteed, so each time I see a post about the podcast or even a rating, I feel extremely grateful for the support. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Hugo Tagholm. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to have Hugo Tagholm, Executive Director of Oceana in the UK. Thanks for joining us today, Hugo.
Morning, Rick. How you doing?
Good. Excited to chat. We always ask our guests first about their relationship with nature, but I think in the UK, at least, your name's pretty synonymous with the ocean. So how do you find and think about your relationship with nature, but maybe specifically with the ocean?
I think my relationship with nature is probably the best place to start because I've always been, massively into the natural world since I was a very small kid. Like many kids are, fascinated with the things that we find from nature, whether it's shells or broken birds' eggs or rocks or different types of plants and animals as we're out and about. In those early years, that held a deep fascination for me, which has always been a sort of a regular sort of pulse to my life. As a kid, I was always found sort of waist deep in ponds, catching frogs and newts, and in rock pools and exploring the shoreline. And all of my holidays were filled with sort of jam jars with specimens in. I remember scorpions and praying mantis in Italy. I remember things I collected in the British countryside, lizards and snakes and things I was always interested in. And then the ocean sort of really took hold in those young years and sort of fused with another great passion of mine, which is sports. And I've always been a big swimmer, a runner, and then in my sort of late sort of childhood, early teens, I was captivated by surfing, firstly on holidays and then spending a lot of time on the coast in the UK and in southwest France. And that has also guided my life ever since. I live in Cornwall, on this sort of great, really Atlantic peninsula with waves on all sides. I'm in the water often. I've just got out of the water, actually. The waves weren't that good today, but I've had really good waves in the last few days. 2024 has started very well, and the sea really shapes us down here, as it does in many coastal places, and it's something I couldn't do without. Getting into the water, spending time particularly with my son and my wife, Darwin and Sarah, and just being around the beach and riding waves. I'm by no means the best surfer, but that feeling of riding along a wave is one of the top sensations out there for me.
Yeah, we tend to have a lot of surfers, I think, on the podcast just because there's such a strong connection with being in the ocean, sort of being at the whim of the ocean and of Mother Nature and experiencing that direct relationship firsthand.
I think it's a great leveler. You strip away a lot of things, and particularly for me in this day and age, and I'm conscious we're doing a podcast here, but particularly it's a place that you can be away from the digital space and some of the digital pressures of life. You're in the water. I mean, I do see, sadly, I did see for the first time not too long ago, the first person on a telephone call on their iWatch, which I thought was a disappointment. I think we should consciously try and be in places where we're not connected, and being disconnected is really important. It allows us to sort of settle our well-being, but also it allows us to be really present when we do come back into the digital space, like recharged, ready to look for other things we want to listen to, learn, other people we want to connect with. And being in the lineup is so important in that respect. I think actually maybe Jacques Cousteau said that the beach and the ocean was one of the great levelers, and I think it's quite true. It strips away sort of many things, and particularly when you're surfing, you're not sort of dueling with nature, but you're trying to align yourself with the pulses of energy that come in from the sea. Those rises and falls of energy, trying to find the best wave. You're trying to sort of commit to pushing over the edge on a wave. You're having to make a lot of decisions very quickly, and I think it's very good cerebrally in that respect. It helps connect the synapses. It helps refine your thinking and decision making in some ways too. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing.
On that point of being recharged and sort of energized by the ocean, I think you were actually probably my way in when I moved to England a few years ago,
Yeah.
into environmental, like ocean environmentalism and the issues here. And I think that comes from your work at Surfers Against Sewage. You were there for more than 14 years. You helped build it into a full-fledged charity. Now you're the executive director of Oceana UK, as we just talked about. So in your expanse, and I think, clearly you're, I think, one of the most active and vocal people in the scene. So in your 15 years of experience working on these ocean issues in the UK, what gives you sort of hope in that, beyond just being in the ocean, getting the energy there, but what gives you that hope to continue to invest your time and effort in the future of our oceans?
Well, look, I'm really always conscious of what a privilege it is to be able to live and work by the sea and spend time in the ocean. It's not something that everyone can do. I work in a job I'm passionate about. I have done for 20 sort of plus years, worked around issues that I've really cared about, particularly at Surfers Against Sewage. And I'm very proud of the journey I took that organization on, from the fringes to the sort of mainstream, and took a lot of the big issues to decision makers and policy makers in the UK and around the world. And we're living through some pretty challenging times, and sort of on two counts. On the personal well-being, I think it's really important that people look after themselves and do things that inspire them. That could be surfing, it could be swimming in the sea, it could be swimming in a river, as many people do now. It could be walking by the sea, it could be walking by a river, it could be going to your local park, it could be doing something else that really lights your inspiration and sort of fire to keep going. And I think that's important. And I think it's important for me in the ocean space, despite all of the doom and gloom out there, and there's a lot of challenging pressures people are facing. We've come through a very hard pandemic, and that really knocked people's confidence. Of course, there was tragedy around the world. It really put the world out of kilter. We've got two big conflicts happening in the world that are very worrying. They could escalate. People are concerned about that. There's the cost of living crisis, but we still live in a really beautiful world on a beautiful planet, and there's lots of things to fight for, not least our ocean. And there's amazing animals. I'm literally looking out at the ocean now, and there's amazing wildlife, marine life in much of our seas, not just around the UK, but around the world. It's at the forefront of people's concerns about protecting and restoring our planet. And where we've decimated lots of ecosystems in terrestrial ecosystems, the bottom line is this: there's lots to protect and restore in the ocean, and the ocean bounces back very quickly. The science shows that. And so we can go from very depleted seas to abundance, pretty quickly in sort of human sort of life terms, and that's exciting. And we should really look at that as we charge into the second half of this ocean decade and charge towards 2030, when the world leaders are really committed to protecting really strongly 30% of our land and ocean, and also sustainably managing the rest of it. And so that's exciting. And people forget we live at a time that the world is recalibrating itself, our energy systems, our food systems, how we do things, what we do, how we travel, the energy we use, the products we can or can't consume. And that's quite an exciting thing to do too, to be part of a time when the whole of society needs to reconfigure itself. So I think we should sort of embrace that and then look to the wild world at what there is to protect, because we still live on an amazing planet. And just to finish, if we went to another planet, if we went up to Mars or wherever and found just one of the let's say houseplants, I'm looking at some plants around the office. If you just found one of those on another planet, governments would invest billions in, maybe trillions in investigating that life form and what it would mean to us. And we've got all of that across our planet in bucket loads. So why don't we invest in protecting what we've got on this beautiful planet?
And so bringing it into that present moment and all the abundance that we have in front of us, the oceans, the waterways in the UK, they're really facing no shortage of issues. There's overfishing, there's bottom trawling, which I saw you on a panel at a Patagonia event
Yeah,
last year talking about, which I think there's been a recent report that it releases up to 370 million tons of carbon per year, which I think
yeah.
people didn't really expect. You've got sewage dumping by our water companies, oil and gas drilling in the North Sea, which turns out isn't actually going to help us save on our energy and gas bills, because
hmm
it's not going to come directly to us. So I could ask you, sort of like, looking at all these issues, what keeps you up at night, but that seems a little obvious. So when you do look at these span of issues in your role at Oceana and as an ocean campaigner and activist, like, how do you prioritize? How do you think about working through all of these challenges?
I think one of the reasons I took on this role at Oceana was because of the amazing organization that it is around the world, and people leading campaigns to protect and restore our ocean in many countries, on marine protected areas, fighting industrialization of those areas, whether it's industrial bottom trawling or whether it's oil and gas, on restoring the health of fish populations in many of our seas, and then fighting some of those big industries, oil and gas and plastics and other things. And I wanted to work on an international level. Ultimately, we're not here to put local small scale fishers out of business and put people in hardship. What we're here to do is make sure nature's got the space to breathe, and then those industries can be supported through the transitions they need to make, and supported in the ways to keep doing things, but make sure they're done more sustainably. And let's just take our marine protected areas. We particularly and very specifically want to stop bottom trawling and dredging in our marine protected areas. It's completely against the principle of marine protection. It's something that the public, on polling last year that we did, is completely shocked to find out about, something that would be akin to ploughing up our national forests, and something that shouldn't happen. That's not to say that fishers shouldn't do it sustainably or with better, lower impact gear in other parts of the ocean, but they shouldn't be doing it in marine protected areas. That space should be there for wildlife. Same for oil and gas. They shouldn't be building these infrastructures anywhere in the ocean, in our opinion. This is a dying industry anyway, particularly in the North Sea. And we've got to make sure that we invest the energy, the skills, the expertise, the engineering, the finances in that transition transition to cleaner, greener energy. And this country is well versed with the need for proper transitions for things. But I think there are deep scars in this country about the sudden and abrupt ending of coal mining in Wales in the 1980s, and how there wasn't a just transition and a reskilling and a retooling of those communities. And I think we've got that front and center. Where industries need to change or sometimes end, we need to take the workers and those communities on the right journey, so we can let nature thrive and let communities thrive. And so our campaigns are focused around that. The water quality thing is something I'm very vocal about. It's really an economic scandal, a financial scandal. These privatized water companies making billions of pounds at the expense of nature, and they've been caught out. And I'm very proud that when I was at SS exposed that time and time again. And I'm very pleased that other organizations have caught up now, and that it's a general sort of public conversation. It was as I was leaving Surfers Against Sewage, and it's going to be a general election issue. The real question will be after the election what it actually becomes, because really it's a 20-25 year plan of investment to tackle the health of our rivers and coastline in relation to sewage, and people need to be ready for that long journey of improvement.
And that journey and that just transition that you just talked about, you also mentioned earlier what people have lived through over the past few years of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So how do you think about getting people engaged on these issues when, for some people, just being able to put food on the table for their family is at the top of their list at the moment?
That's a really good question. I don't think any environmental issues in their sort of own right are going to necessarily cut through at the general election unless they're seen through the lens of the economy and jobs. Those two things are so important, and a lot of the things we've talked about are actually about doing that, are about safeguarding the future and creating future prosperity and future jobs and future hope for people. So just take the transition to renewable energy, offshore and onshore, set to create tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of highly skilled, highly paid jobs, often where there aren't any of those highly paid, highly skilled jobs. It's set to give us energy security, something that's been top of people's mind over the last few years with some of the conflicts taking place. It's set to lower our bills. Offshore wind is one of the cheapest forms of energy we now have in this country. And so this is like good on jobs, good on the economy, good on the cost of living crisis. And this is something that people should understand in that context. And then it's also good in terms of the climate crisis, which is, the biggest overarching threat to our ocean and our, planetary sort of ecosystem, as it were. So we've always got to look through the lens of jobs and the economy. The same on fishing. A lot of the fishing quota is hoovered up by just a handful of big companies that are effectively taking the livelihoods from local, more sustainable fishers. And it's something that we need to really tackle in the coming years alongside the fishing community. This is a similar story of big industry riding roughshod over communities that we've talked about in the water industry. And we've got to make sure that these two things aren't dressed up as one as the same. Small scale fishers are not the same as big multinational companies taking away quota from those local interests. And then marine protected areas are part of our 30 by 30 commitment, and none of our industries and jobs would be thriving if it isn't for a stable planet. And we've really got to start to change the status quo on that. We need to give nature a space to thrive so fish stocks can bounce back. To use a term I don't like very much, the ecosystem services, the functioning natural ecosystem and everything it gives us, oxygen, clean water, food, health, all of these things can actually have space to thrive. So this is about creating a prosperous, hopeful, jobs-rich future, and not just in London or our big cities, but around our coastline and in other places where people need that type of employment the most.
As part of your work, you've befriended His Majesty the King. You created Ocean Conservation All-Party Parliamentary Group. When you have these sort of conversations, politicians, even the monarchy, what sort of things do you talk to them about? How do you help engage them in some of the issues that you're working on?
My conversation with the then Prince of Wales and now King was really sparked by the plastic pollution crisis and everything that I had done in my previous role. I had founded the Million Mile Beach Clean. I had created and founded the plastic-free communities. We had a number of really big campaigns, particularly around deposit return schemes, one of the biggest plastic pollution petitions of the time, about 300,000 people, which we took to Downing Street, and overwhelming action in every corner of the country on that issue. And so that was something we talked about a lot, and I got to spend many sort of meetings with His Royal Highness the King, and spent a fair bit of time with him. He became patron of Surfers Against Sewage, and I spent time introducing him to a lot of people over the course of a number of years, which was a great honor and a privilege, and maybe an unusual alliance. I think it put SAS even more on the map. It gave SAS a lot of muscle power at the time, which was good, and something that it continues to as it were, thrive because of. And having conversations with any of those people, I think it's easy to think that you've got to turn up and adapt yourself to something you think they want to hear. But ultimately, I think you've got to go and be yourself and take what you've done to them. So I never faked it. It was always genuinely, authentically about campaigns that originated at the coastline, new emerging things, whether it was our real-time alerts on water quality, which are now so prevalent and popular amongst the public, the Safer Sea Service, or whether it was plastic pollution initiatives. It was always coming in really authentically. And I think that's what sort of won it. And that's something I do now with all of our campaigns, very authentic discussions around our relationship with the sea, why we want to fight for marine protected areas, why we need to stop oil and gas. And that David and Goliath fight between everyday coastal people and big business is something that I feel fundamentally part of.
Thank you so much, Hugo, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rick. Good to talk.